So, on to a little bit of a rant. I hope you can spare me 5 or 10 minutes worth of discussion on this because I think it's important. It's super important. We've been on it all year, and I'm just going to go right into it. Okay, so a lot of talk this week about whether or not Ohio State should be in the playoff if Penn State wins the conference championship. And I honestly think these discussions are ludicrous, and I'll tell you why. I know the committee puts a lot of weight on whether or not you win your conference, and I think that's great and all. It makes for a good metric, a good notch in terms of what type of guideline you want. But honestly, it's worthless. It's not completely worthless. Don't think I'm crazy. I'm not throwing it out. But all conferences are not created equal. Is winning the Big 12 this year better than finishing second in the Big 10? No, absolutely not. It is not. End of story. So from that standpoint, I think it's kind of ridiculous. From the other angle, in this case, we're talking about, if we're just comparing the two teams, an Ohio State team that has, I think, 4 ranked wins, 3 top 10 wins, 2 on the road. Out of conference, they beat the crap out of Oklahoma on the road, who's going to be a top 10 team at the end of the season. And a Penn State team who currently is sitting on 1 ranked win. I think Iowa might have snuck in the top 25 this week, but if they don't win their bowl game, will fall back out. They're right there on the edge. So Penn State is looking at 1 ranked win, and their second best win is Iowa, who lost to Northwestern and an FCS school. The rest of their schedule is pretty much garbage. And in that schedule, where they went and scheduled a Pitt out of conference, who's actually better now than they originally scheduled them, but still not great. That Pitt team beat them. And Temple, who's okay, but a 7-point win over Temple, a 3-point win over Minnesota. These are not teams that should give a playoff team any kind of trouble. So what I've said for a long time is you don't just look at the wins and losses. You also look at how teams play against middling competition. And if you play crappy competition and you barely beat them week in and week out, which they have done, then maybe they're not that great. And the other thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up and let you talk. I get so frustrated when people get so high on a team based on their last few games. We need to consider the entire schedule. The loss to Pitt matters. The 49-10 loss to Michigan matters. It didn't happen last year. It happened this season. That's part of the resume. And just because you lost in September and are winning in November doesn't negate that loss. I think it's ridiculous that if Penn State lost to Michigan right now, 49-10, everybody would be like, oh, forget about them. Well, they lost a few weeks ago, 49-10. So unless we can consider the entire schedule, the whole thing is worthless, and we should just blow the whole thing up. So that's at least the open to my rant. What do you think?
I have to agree. There's always a lot of talk, right? That the playoff, it really devalues the regular season. I don't think the playoff is devaluing the regular season as much as the emphasis on conference champions is devaluing the regular season. That sounds weird because you say, well, that doesn't make any sense, right? You should be winning your conference championship, but if you don't, yeah, but when you allow a team to win the conference championship and go to the playoff and you ignore everything else that happened, right? There's talk that, well, maybe Oklahoma should be considered for the playoff this year. Oklahoma got curb stomped by Ohio State. There is no planet where I think Oklahoma, having been beaten by Houston quite badly and being stomped by Ohio State, deserves to make the playoff. I don't care that they're the conference champion. You have to consider the entire season, and part of that season was the fact that they played 2 out-of-conference games, got stomped, and don't deserve to be in. But what's happening is so that's the first order effect, right? And the second order effect is when you allow conference championships to matter that much, it really decentivizes you to play a major out-of-conference game. Why risk having a loss if you can play an absolutely weak schedule, win the conference championship, and go anyway. I mean, if you're going to let Penn State win the conference championship and go to the playoff with a loss to Pitt, then why don't look at me and tell me that non-conference scheduling matters, because they didn't really schedule anybody difficult out of conference. They lost, and you're going to put them in, where Ohio State schedules what is at least a pretty difficult Oklahoma team, top 10 team, and wins that game handily. And yeah, they may have lost the conference championship or shot at the conference championship, but they only lose one game. They won a big out of conference game. That should matter. And I think, we had a long discussion about this with before the Ohio State Michigan game. I think a lot of people probably took it wrong when we were talking about the bag of wins, but the addition, particularly of like Rutgers and Maryland, what it's done more than anything is it's propped up a lot of teams like Penn State and like Nebraska to be in a position to win the conference championship without really having to play anybody else. And, Penn State plays Ohio State and Michigan, goes 1-1, and that's all they had to do. And they lose to Pitt. But like you said, they weren't challenged the rest of the year. Penn State doesn't have to play Wisconsin.
And I
We
think
don't.
before you go any further, because I want you to include this in the context of what you're saying, I think it's worth noting that Ohio State drew Wisconsin and Nebraska 1 and 2 out of the West. Penn State drew Iowa, Minnesota 3 and 4 out of the West. So Penn State didn't even have to play the best team in the West this year. And who was Ohio State playing the week before they went on the road to Penn State? They were playing at Camp Randall against Wisconsin in a tough game, overtime game, where they left probably a little bit beaten up. And I'm not taking away the credit for Penn State winning that game, but who did they play before Ohio State? They played Maryland, who they could have sent their third team out without any prep and probably beaten them. So technically they kind of got an extra week of prep or whatever. I just think it's worth noting that they didn't play anybody out of the West. All schedules, even within the same conference, are not created equal. Penn State didn't play as hard of a schedule, and the only reason Penn State is going to be in the conference championship game is because Ohio State did the dirty business that Penn State couldn't do, and that's beat Michigan, a team that when Penn State played them lost 49-10, which again matters.
Right. And so we do read the comments. I think my colleague here responds to most of them. I tend to try to stay out of the fray, but a lot of people were angry. I think somebody called me a retard because I pointed out why is Penn State getting in this? Well, Penn State beat Ohio State, who beat Michigan, who beat Penn State. And it just so happened the way the tiebreakers shaked out that Penn State ended up in the conference championship. But it's not, you can't just look at Penn State's win over Ohio State in a vacuum. And I was saying all this and everybody's upset, but realize I'm actually defending Ohio State and Michigan here. I'm saying the addition, Delaney deciding to expand the Big 10 into the Big 14 now, adding a Rutgers team that has just went 0-9 in conference play and 2-10 overall, and a Maryland team that went 3-6. What that did is it let Wisconsin and Nebraska and Penn State get to the conference championship game basically just by not having to play a real schedule. Everybody's talking about Penn State, but Wisconsin may, in fact, in my opinion, probably will win the conference championship against Penn State. And so, what if Wisconsin wins it? Wisconsin's ranked 6th right now, and Wisconsin, last I checked, lost to Michigan and Ohio State. The only reason that they're going to be in the conference championship game is that they happen not to play in the Western Division, and they happen to play a Penn State team that kind of lucked out with the way the tiebreakers worked, and as you said, played Ohio State coming off the game with Wisconsin. And so Wisconsin may end up being the Big Ten champion, even though we know they are worse than both Michigan and Ohio State. And it's just, in my opinion, it's just due to the bloat from conference expansion. And in a way, it helps because it gives teams a better record, and it's going to help the Big Ten have somebody with a really good record to put in the playoff picture. But it's also really screwed up competition within the conference. And in my opinion, you have the wrong teams in the conference championship. And you can say, well, Penn State won it on the field. It's like, yeah, they won it on the field, but they also didn't have to play all these other games that created the opportunity that, maybe I know it's in a vacuum 1 year, all that, but it made things pretty unfair for Ohio State and Michigan this year. So yeah, no, I don't think I was a retard. And yeah, no, it just is what it is.
Yeah, and what's funny is just what you said. Everybody who's vehemently fighting for Penn State or Wisconsin to get in over an Ohio State because conference champion is basically saying that they value tiebreaker rules more than they value the actual games that have been played this season. They value tiebreaker rules more than they value the fact that Ohio State scheduled an Oklahoma, beat the crap out of them on the road, and Penn State scheduled a Pitt and lost. That's basically what they're saying, is that Ohio State, after playing a Wisconsin team that Penn State didn't have to play, goes to Penn State, loses on a blocked field goal, and because of the tiebreaker rules, because remember, Penn State didn't have to beat Michigan, because of the tiebreaker rules, Penn State gets to go, Ohio State doesn't, even though they clearly have the better resume. Their strength of schedule, depending on who you look at for strength of schedule metrics, varies from like 20 points better to 70 points better. None of them have Penn State having a better strength of schedule, and Penn State has an extra loss, and Penn State needs the extra game just to get that second or third ranked win. So for me, it's kind of a slam dunk, but we're so locked into this mentality that if you win a Power 5 conference, you must go to the playoffs. But it's not about that. It's about getting the best 4 teams in the playoffs. And I'm saying this as an SEC fan who would benefit from seeing a team like Penn State instead of Ohio State in the playoff. It's not to our advantage to be lobbying for this, but I want to see the best 4 teams in there, and I don't think that's crazy.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's disappointing when you see some of the stuff shake out. Last year, well, first we had a long discussion right about this bag of wins thing, and we both said last week Nebraska had no business being ranked where they were, and the end result of that, of course, this past week is Nebraska loses 40-10 to Iowa. And along the same coin, last year we saw Iowa get to the conference championship game, lose 16-13 to Michigan State, and probably had no business being there because they didn't play Ohio State and they didn't play Michigan. And Iowa ends up in the freaking Rose Bowl with Stanford and gets the doors blown off them. And it's really an absolute shame that they were in there and Ohio State was not. But Iowa got in because they had this great record against a weak resume, and that's how they ended up doing it.